Hello, my name's Nigel King. I'm a consultant clinical neuropsychologist at Bucks Healthcare and at the University of Oxford. And I'm just going to be talking today about cognitive problems with long COVID. And we're going to look at various aspects of this, thinking about what it looks like to have cognitive problems following long COVID, but also to think some of the practical ways that we might be able to how to manage these kinds of problems. So I'll just go on through my slides and just to think about this in more detail, just to be aware that actually after fatigue, cognitive difficulties are the most commonly reported long COVID symptom. So very, very common for people to experience cognitive difficulties. And the 5 most commonly reported cognitive problems after long COVID come under these categories. So concentration being the most commonly reported difficulty, then brain fog, forgetfulness, word finding, and then saying or typing the wrong word. That's not exclusive. There are many other forms and types of cognitive difficulties that people have after long COVID, but these are the 5 that are the most commonly reported by people when one does surveys of these kinds of difficulties. And one of the things I just want to kind of kick off with thinking about cognitive difficulties after long COVID is the fact that they can often, over time, become an interaction of symptoms concerned with cognitive difficulties. So many people will experience these cognitive problems after long COVID, but the symptoms will vary enormously from person to person. And they might be the normal part of the recovery process, but when they become prolonged, they can often interact with each other. And what you'll see from this diagram is that you've got 4 circles that intersect in a number of places. And what this is just showing is that actually over time, certain difficulties after long COVID can become associated with other difficulties, which then make the cognitive difficulties even worse, and so on. So in this particular situation, we can see at the top bubble has slowed thinking, concentration difficulties, distractibility, forgetfulness, brain fog, those kinds of things would be cognitive difficulties faced after long COVID. But clearly, if we are experiencing those problems, that can put us under more pressure, put us under more stress, make us less able to manage our day-to-day life as well. And that could then lead to some of the things in the bottom bubble. So sadness, anxiety, restlessness, irritability. And if we're experiencing those kinds of difficulties, that will make our cognitive difficulties even worse. It will make, because we've got more on our mind, our mind is doing more things. And over time, that may then lead to some of the bubbles, some of the things in the bubbles on the left-hand side. So it may then start to interfere with our sleep, or our sleep may also be interfered with just because of long COVID symptoms. So the disrupted sleep or having too much or too little sleep. And then that clearly will add to our feelings of fatigue, make our cognitive symptoms more difficulty and put us under more pressure and so on. And equally, some of the things on the right-hand bubble, we may have developed headaches, dizziness, sensitivity to light or noise, fatigue, the reduced stamina. All of these things may be another part and parcel of the things that are experienced as part of our long COVID difficulties. And these then interact and make cognitive difficulties more pronounced because we have even more that our brain is having to cope with and manage on top of the cognitive difficulties that immediately we're presenting. So it's important just to remember that they can over time become an interaction of symptoms following long COVID, and that includes the cognitive difficulties that are very common after long COVID or with long COVID. So just going back before we think about the reduced thinking stamina, if we think about some of the things that we spoke about in that last slide, you can see that over time, we might find that actually some of our cognitive symptoms or other symptoms may start to be caused or at least contributed by other factors over time, because things like stress, low mood, pain, as well as long COVID can have an effect on our cognitive processing. So we'll see in this particular instance reduced thinking stamina. That can be affected by long COVID, but also stress, low mood, pain, disrupted sleep will also add to that, or indeed can be in and of itself the thing that causes reduced thinking stamina. So over time, it may be that that factor increases. Even if our long COVID symptoms are improving, we may not notice it maybe as well as we might otherwise do, because our reduced thinking stamina is being caused by maybe other things. So reduced thinking stamina can occur because the information processing capacity of our brain is just lowered. And this means that we're less able to process as much information as before, or as quickly as before. So in other words, the brain can become more easily overloaded, and we can call that cognitive overload. And for some people, that feels like the brain just switches off. It just has too much information and just is in overload. Some people find an analogy of thinking about a car that used to run on 4 cylinders that's now running on 3 cylinders as a good analogy of what it can be like to be managing reduced thinking stamina. A car normally works on 4 cylinders, gets from A to B very easily, goes up hills very quickly, and doesn't use up much petrol doing so, and so doesn't need to be refilled very often. If it's running on 3 cylinders, it may still get from A to B, it may still get up hills, but it's using up much more petrol, and will eventually get overloaded, fatigued, as it were, and require refilling these petrol refilling. So in some ways, having reduced thinking stamina can be a little bit like you're a car that's running on 3 cylinders rather than 4 cylinders, so that these things occur much more quickly. The other way of thinking about reducing thinking stamina is to think about juggling balls mentally in our mind. So before our long COVID, it may be that mentally at any given time, we could juggle 5, 6 or 7 balls all at the same time. We can be reading something, there can be music on in the background, somebody could be talking to us, and we could also be thinking about what we're going to be doing later on in the day, all at the same time. And there's so 5 or 6 different things that are going on. It may also be a busy environment where people are coming in and out and interrupting us, but we can juggle all those balls in the moment. And what can happen with reduced thinking stamina after long COVID is that actually we can only juggle 2 balls, say, or 3 balls, rather than the 6 or 7 before. And so that means that actually, again, we get overloaded, balls get dropped, or they're just not attended to, because we just don't have that capacity. We're just juggling 2 balls. And so we can't multitask in the same way. And so what we find is that we may notice that we're a lot slower because information needs to be taken on board in smaller amounts. We may find we're much more distractible as it takes much more effort to continue to concentrate on an activity. We may find that actually we're very forgetful because less information can be stored in our mind in the moment at any given time, because we don't have enough balls to operate that part of our thinking. We may get fatigued very quickly, and that's very common when we have reduced thinking stamina, because again, we are possibly running on 3 cylinders rather than 4 cylinders, so we're using up a lot more mental energy just to do all the things, or even some of the things that we had done previously. And we may find that we get irritable or more stressed or even low because our mind is under more stress, it's overloaded. And sometimes the consequence of that is that it affects us emotionally, and in many ways, how could it not? How could it's a very natural reaction that if we're feeling under this much pressure or this much overload, and we're having to put this much energy into doing our day-to-day tasks, it's quite natural for us, from time to time at least, for it to have an emotional consequence, us snapping more easily, getting more irritable, being under more stress, finding that we're anxious. And then, as we say, we can go back to the previous slide and see how then that may start then to affect our sleep and other things, and then that kind of maybe adds to the whole picture. So that's one thing for us to kind of just be thinking about. So if we have reduced thinking stamina, which is a very common part of long COVID cognitive difficulties, what are the kinds of things that can help? Well, things like working in quiet settings with no distractions. So having not the radio on or the TV anymore, and asking people not to interrupt us when we have got to concentrate on a task that takes a lot of mental effort, may not always be possible, but just knowing that that might help can be helpful. Some people ask, well, are there brain training exercises that can be helpful in kind of training my brain to build up its cognitive stamina? Unfortunately, there isn't any, we haven't got any clear evidence at the moment to suggest that brain training exercise do very much apart from make us better at the exercise. As yet, we can't, there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that if we do a particular brain training exercise, that will make our brain more efficient in that area and that will generalize into our everyday life. What most likely will happen is that we will get better at that exercise, but it won't have any significant effect. And so the things that help, as we'll see as we go down this list, are very much the more practical things of getting around or managing these cognitive difficulties as effectively as we can. So working in quiet settings with no distractions. Maybe we need to break activities down into small sections with lots of small breaks between them. And it can be really, really important to make sure that we get lots of small breaks in our day, even when we're feeling good. Some people think, well, I will only break if I'm starting to feel tired or I'm feeling overloaded, and then my body is telling me that I need a break. Well, that's good, but it's much better to schedule in small breaks very regularly during the day, come what may, whether we're feeling good or bad. And that will help extend what we can do, but it'll also make us more efficient. So don't worry that it feels like I'm wasting time because I'm having a 5-minute break every half hour. Actually, it is making you more efficient because you'll be able to go for longer, but also you'll be able to attend to your activity in a much more efficient way. So that's a really important strategy if we can implement it, is to have lots of small mini breaks over the course of the day, maybe 5 minutes every half hour, something like that, in which we can just switch off, have a cup of tea, stare out of the window, do something that just gives our brain a little bit of a break to help it recharge. Another strategy can be doing routine and familiar tasks when we know that our fatigue or concentration is going to be at its worst. So we may know that actually towards the end of an afternoon or even early afternoon or towards the end of the week, we know that actually brain fatigue is starting to really come into play where our concentration is not going to be so good. Well, if we can do routine and familiar tasks in those worst times, that will be helpful because they take up much less mental effort and energy. And then conversely, we may want to do new or unfamiliar tasks when we're at our best. So again, that might be in the morning or the beginning of the week, say. But it will differ from people to people. But when we're doing a new or unfamiliar task, it's taking up a lot more mental effort than when we're doing routine ones. When we do routine ones, some ways if they're routine enough, they will be almost on autopilot because we've done them so many times. It's just part of automatic thinking, and that takes up very little mental energy. Whereas for unfamiliar tasks or new tasks, take up a lot of concentration. It may be that we will need to use a diary to plan a day, so maybe on our phone or a paper diary, but something that helps plan the day, pace ourselves, reminds us of the things we need to do, like appointments. It's a way of getting what's in our mind, juggling away, having an extra ball that we're having to think about, actually out of our mind and onto paper or onto our phone or onto our electronic device. It takes away one ball that we're juggling and puts it elsewhere. So that can be a really important part of a strategy because it means that we just have one more ball that we can juggle with to do our things, as opposed to having a ball that's juggling, trying to remember what we're supposed to be doing today, planning things, and reminding us, also the worry that we might forget. Well, if we've got something that's really very, very good way in terms of diary planning, that can be very, very helpful. And it may be that actually one of the other strategies that's really important is to just cut down some of our non-essential activity. And this may be just learn to be able to say no to things and not feel guilty about this. If we have cognitive difficulties with long COVID, it means that we have less amount of cognitive resource over any given day or any given week. And as we will see later, if our demands exceed our resources, we're going to start to feel a lot worse. And so it may be that we need to think about, well, actually, what is essential activity? What are the things that I need to say no to? Because actually, I need to get my demands and my resources slightly better aligned. So that's some of the things that can definitely help in terms of the practical management of these kind of difficulties that come from cognitive stamina, mental stamina. Another very common area of cognitive difficulty with long COVID is memory. So again, there are many different reasons why somebody might have memory problems. It could be stress, it could be low mood, it could be pain, it could definitely be long COVID. And these problems, when we do have memory problems, tend to be for day-to-day memory. So memory for new things, things that people said half an hour ago, what did I do yesterday, rather than for the older memories, the long-term memories, which are much better established. So it's the new information, it's the short-term memory that's often the thing that's the key difficulty. And just thinking about memory, there's 3 stages to memory. There's the first initial learning of something. So we're concentrating on something, we're able to attend to it. And if we do that well enough, that will get into a storage, the kind of filing cabinet in the brain. And then later on, when we need to remember it, we'll need to recall it. So we need to concentrate enough to get it in the filing cabinet. It gets in the filing cabinet, and then we need to find it in the filing cabinet a bit later on. So learning is when we first concentrate on something. Storage is when it's kind of there in the filing cabinet, and recall is getting the information back when we need it a bit later on from the filing cabinet, as it were. So in terms of memory difficulties, so day-to-day memory difficulties, memory for new information, well, again, a very useful strategy is using a mobile phone, a diary, something that very systematically has things that reminds us of what we need to do. Again, it's a bit like the cognitive stamina. It just means that we are taking away one of those balls that's trying to remember things, and it's putting it elsewhere. It's subcontracting, as it were, our memory difficulty to a storage device, be it a paper device, an electronic device, or whatever. The second memory strategy is to be as organized as possible in our everyday life, to be doing certain things at set times, having set routines, always leaving things that you use a lot in the same place. So the more that we've got routines, the more we've got things that are kind of autopilot, things that we just do same place, same time, same way, same day, the more that becomes a good strategy, because it's using up less and less mental energy to remember these things, as opposed to just using routines. Routines and autopilot are excellent ways of managing memory, because they take up very little mental processing. And you may have experienced that many times. Lots of people will say, well, I can almost get to work in the morning without even remembering what I've done, because I get up, I brush my teeth, I have a shower, I put my clothes on, I have my breakfast in a certain way, I get in the car, it's the same route. And actually it's so routine that I barely remember doing it, because it's autopilot. And so the more we can do that when we've got long COVID cognitive difficulties, the better. It may be that we need to use alarms on our watches or on our computer or elsewhere to remind us to look at our diary, to do certain things. For example, if one's taking medication, we may need something that alerts us to that. But also, people will often use alarms to periodically remind themselves to look at their diary, or that they need to take a break. It goes off every half hour or an hour to look at their diary or to take a break. So using the mobile phone or electronic organizer to set reminders to prompt to do things can be really good. It may be that we use the dictaphone facility on our phones, or just a tape recorder or normal dictaphone, to help us when we're attending meetings or lectures or things like that. So again, with permission from the person that's conducting the meeting or the lecture, if we're able to record certain things, again, that takes the pressure off. It means that there's one less ball having to try to remember what we're listening to. We can just listen to what's being said, attend to it, because we know that we can always come back to it from the recording if need be. It may be that we've got somebody who's a friend or a relative that can be somebody that helps to remind you to do things. Again, it's subcontracting one of these balls that's being used up to try to remember new information elsewhere. Some people will find a whiteboard or something like that in a prominent place in their home really, really helpful as well. to have everything up that's going to be happening during the week, when it's going to be happening, to remind us of the information that we need to be aware of. And the fact that we go past that thing in our house often, and we see it very often, again, just helps to continually update and solidify us being aware of what we're doing. And it gives us maybe a greater sense of control and predictability about what's going on, because if we're struggling with juggling balls, I can often very quickly feel things are going a bit out of control, which again will have a knock-on effect in terms of stress. And it may be things like practical things like sat-nav devices, if we're needing to go to new or unfamiliar places, and really helpful ways of backing up the memory if we have memory difficulties. These are just some of the things. There will be many other ways in which we can help these kinds of difficulties, and they will be very individual for every given person, very specific, and there is no limit. So be creative of practical ways to back up the memory or to help build structure, routine, predictability in terms of our memory difficulties. So that's the kind of second strand in terms of thinking about cognitive difficulties. So we've thought about mental stamina, and now we've thought about memory. And then the third thing that can be really helpful, which I kind of alluded to a few minutes ago, is thinking about the demands that we have and our resources. So sometimes it'd be helpful to think of managing cognitive difficulties following long COVID in the context of balancing your internal resources and the demands. So the resources are the physical and cognitive and mental energy to cope with things, and the demands are the physical, cognitive, mental, social requirements of you, including the sensory stimulation that might be in your environment. So we could think about, well, here are my resources that I had before my long COVID, and those were the demands that I had before long COVID, and my resources were higher than my demands. So generally speaking, I kind of managed and got through, wasn't too irritable, didn't get too stressed, because my resources were higher than my demands. And then after long COVID, if we've got cognitive difficulties in particularly, our resources reduce. And that means there can be a gap there between the demands that we have and the resources that we have. And so one of the key things is to think about, well, actually, what I need to do is be able to get my resources below my demands, as it were. And so my demands below my resources, so that actually I have more resource than I have demand. Because once we get into this phase, this gap here, which I call the red zone, that brings its own problems and it's more demands. Because if we get in that red zone, then actually we're now starting to feel stressed, irritable, not being our normal selves, and that's another demand. And then we're even worse. We're in a worse situation then, because we're really irritable and we're really stressed and we're totally out of control and we're cognitively overloaded, and that's even more of a demand. So you can see how there's a tipping point that once we get into the red zone, that brings even more demands, that puts us even deeper into the red zone. So that's why having lots of breaks, lots of things that kind of give us a bit of a mental recharge to get us back below the demands that we have is important. So our resources are greater than our demands. So this is a kind of little diagram that kind of shows that in a slightly clearer form. So you've got your resources on the left, you've got your demands on the right, and after our long COVID, it might well be that actually we've managed to look at our demands, and actually our resources are actually now greater than our demands. And so we're in the green zone, and we're managing kind of okay, or we're managing as best as we can. And we're not getting irritable too often, we're not getting overly stressed too often, we're not feeling out of control too often, and that's the way in which we're going to best manage what's going on. But then you'll see in the diagram at the bottom what happens when inadvertently our demands slightly start to increase, and we may not notice that very quickly, but if our demands do slowly increase and then exceed our resources, that's when we're in the red zone. And as I say, once we get into the red zone, that's when the tipping point happens, because once we're in the red zone, we're starting to feel more irritable, more stressed, more out of control, and that in itself is another demand. It's another ball that we're having to juggle, and we haven't got enough. We don't have enough juggling ability to be able to kind of manage all of that at the same time. So another really important strategy is to be thinking about resources versus our demands and trying to keep that in balance. And nobody can do that perfectly. It's absolutely impossible to do that perfectly. Life doesn't allow us to do that. But just bearing in mind these principles can be helpful, A, to understand what might be going on when we're starting to feel worse or not managing very well, but B, what then the solution might be. Even if we can't implement it now, at least I know what to do at some point in the future in order to balance this up. So thinking about the kind of the bigger picture, we've got to think about what's the overall target when we're managing cognitive difficulties after long COVID. So you've got the middle zone where we're completely comfortable, we're hardly doing anything, we're not getting any better, because actually we're not even trying to see where the boundaries are in terms of our demands and our resources, and so we're actually probably doing less than we might be able to. So some people kind of, in a way, quite naturally retreat into this area of kind of complete comfort. And that's okay, because it means that actually, in a way, you're not getting into the red zone. But better is to slowly and in a very structured way over a long period of time, is just from time to time, just to occasionally test out those barriers of comfort. So trying to see whether actually there is a green zone that we can push that a little bit, and if we are able to push into a green zone and just experiment with doing slightly more, we may find that over time, if we do that enough, that becomes our new comfort zone, and then we've got a bigger comfort zone and more scope to occasionally, systematically, in a slow way, gradually just test out whether we've got room to do a little bit more. And what we're avoiding is the red zone, which is where we actually just do too much too soon, and actually it's excessive strain. We challenge ourselves too much, and then we find that we get worse, not because our long COVID is getting worse in any way, but because all those other factors from that first slide are coming to start to play in terms of our difficulties. So what this helps us to do is to slowly but surely try to reclaim little bits of normality back, the normality that we've lost with our long COVID cognitive symptoms, and they can be huge amounts of normality, huge amounts of who we are that we've lost because of the long COVID cognitive difficulties. It helps us just to slowly to try to reclaim tiny bits of that back in small and graduated way. And sometimes it can be really important to think about actually what were the values, what were the important things to me before, and actually might there be other ways or things that I can do that actually give me the same values and sense of importance and help in terms of my identity, even if they're not exactly the same things as they were before. And a good example might be that before our long COVID cognitive difficulties, we worked full time, 40 hours a week. But actually right now, I'm going to try and do a little bit of voluntary work, maybe an hour, 2 days a week. So that hour, 2 days a week of doing voluntary work actually does fulfill some of those values that we get, and there's some of that important aspect of what happens when we're working. But actually, for now, that's the reclaiming back of normality that is possible with our current resources. But then over time, we may then be starting to push that ever so slightly and ever so slightly, so that that green zone becomes bigger and the comfort zone becomes bigger. And what we're trying to avoid, if we possibly can, and again, it's impossible to do perfectly, but we're trying to avoid having a boom bust approach to how we are managing our symptoms. So often people will want to just power through and keep going. And quite a lot of people, they've got through. That's how they get through life. You know, they're people that just push on through. They burn the midnight oil if needs be. We'll do an all-nighter. No pain, no gain. We'll just power on through. We'll just put in more effort, and we'll keep going. And that helps me to get through my day-to-day activities or when things get stressful. But when we've got cognitive difficulties with long COVID, it's quite possible that actually that approach just doesn't work. And actually, if we do that, what we end up with is a boom bust. That we increase what we're doing because it makes us feel actually we're reclaiming normality. We do loads and loads because we're feeling a bit better. That absolutely wipes us out. We then have a payback where we just can't do anything. We need a long rest to recharge our batteries. That's the payback. And then we start to feel a bit better. And then we think, okay, right, I'm getting right back on the horse. I'm going back to doing 100%. And it feels good for a little bit because we're doing it. But then we get to a point where actually we just have to rest or sleep. And then we're back into the bust. So it's boom bust. So this is a pattern of high activity, but that eventually leads us to cause to be resting or sleeping, and it's exhausting to keep going through that pattern. And also it just makes life less in control, makes life less feel stable, it makes life feel less predictable. So a combination of this slide and the previous slide, what a good thing to do is, if we can, is to kind of find out, well, what is our baseline level of activities and demands that we can manage on a good day and a bad day. Good day, bad day, I know that this is the amount that I can do, and I can do that okay. Come on, mate, good day, bad day. And that becomes our kind of baseline, is this. And we make sure that we can do that over a number of weeks. From hell or high water, that's our baseline. And then in a very systematic but gradual way, we then say, well, okay, let's see if I change that baseline to add maybe 5 or 10% to it, maybe in terms of its intensity or duration of what I've got during my day and week. Let's just see if we can, what that feels like. And if I do it for 4 or 5 weeks, do I eventually find actually I can do that relatively in a stable way on a good day and a bad day? And then if we manage to do that, then we've got a new baseline. We've got a new improved baseline. We've increased that green zone, as it were. And then we've got the opportunity to say, well, okay, now at my new baseline, I can try another maybe 5% in terms of intensity or duration. And again, let's see if over 4 or 5 weeks I can get that as my new baseline in terms of feeling comfortable with. And we may find that actually that was too much, so we have to go back down again and then try maybe a slightly smaller increase. But that can often be a good way of slowly but surely just claiming back other little bits of normality in a more systematic way, or a way that feels more in control, that we may have more stability, and just minimizes this boom bust scenario that can be it can cause its own difficulties, because it then goes back to that first slide with the 4 bubbles starting to interact more. So that's another aspect of managing cognitive difficulties with long COVID, and can be a very, very important part of that. And again, it's impossible to do this perfectly. Life doesn't allow us to always get this right. But again, just the fact that if we know that this can be part of what doesn't help our long COVID symptoms, at least we can sometimes identify that that might be going on, but also tells us what the solution might be, even if it's not a solution right today because there's too much going on. Over time, this is the solution that I want to try to work towards. So minimizing boom bust can be really, really helpful in terms of managing cognitive difficulties following long COVID. And then the last thing for us to consider is, again, thinking about how it makes us feel when we are experiencing these things in a very significant way. And one of the ways in kind of to think about what the experience is like is just, this is called the cognitive behavioural framework, for one of those. So we're thinking, this is it's a long word that basically mean thoughts, feelings and behaviours. So the way we think about situations can affect the way we feel and behave. So the cognitive behavioural framework is quite simple in a way, but it's very powerful, because what it says is that actually what we do, our behaviours on the left, what our thoughts at the top, what our feelings on the right, and our physical sensations at the bottom, all interact off each other in every possible way. And that's the key thing. We all know that if we're feeling sad, we're going to have sad thoughts, and that's probably going to make our feelings worse. But also, if we have sad thoughts, that will make us feel sad. Similarly, if we're feeling sad, we probably will start to do less because we are feeling lethargic, fatigued, and hopeless. But also, if we happen just to be doing less, actually that's going to make us feel sadder because we're having less things that are going on in our life that give us a sense of achievement and a sense of pleasure. So all of these things interact for each other in every single way. And so exploring sometimes what's going on in terms of our thinking and what we're doing can sometimes help us to be thinking about, well, okay, the emotional impact of what's going on for me, I might be able to do something about. Because again, minimizing the amount of stress and the negative emotional impact of struggling with all these difficulties that can occur as part of long COVID cognitive difficulties will in and of itself give us more cognitive energy and freedom and an extra juggling ball, as it were, to be able to manage our day-to-day lives. The more we can reduce the stress, the more we can reduce the irritability, the more we can reduce the negative critical thoughts, the better, because it will free up more mental energy to actually do what we want to be doing with our reduced resources. So this is an example, a memory example of somebody that's maybe going into a situation and they're going to be meeting, maybe it's a party, and their thoughts are, well, I know my memory's terrible, my short-term memory's shot to pieces, I can't remember anything anymore, I'm just going to forget everything, it's going to be terrible. So that's the thought that they're going into this party. Well, clearly, if you're thinking my memory's useless, I'm not going to remember anything, I'm going to forget everything, it's going to be terrible, the feeling that we're going to have is going to be worry, and we're going to be stressed going into the party. And then that will obviously make our thought even stronger, because we're feeling stressed now. We can't, which means our memory is even going to be worse than it would have been before. But it also means we may then start doing something difficult. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep repeating over and over and over and over what somebody's name is. I'm really going to concentrate on that. I'm going to use lots and lots of strategies to try to remember everything that people tell me, but that's using up mental energy that makes us more likely to forget rather than to remember, because we're so concentrated, we're so attending to our strategies that we're not paying attention as we would normally do to just what's going on in the party and enjoying it as best we can. And then what's likely to be happening if we're getting more stress, we're getting a heartbeat's going faster, we're noticing we're starting to get hot, maybe a bit dizzy, because those are the physical symptoms of stress. And then that, of course, is using up even more mental energy and making our thoughts even more pronounced, that I'm not going to remember anything. And then we might have really self-critical thoughts like, I'm a failure. If I can't remember things, I'm a failure. I'm useless. And really strong, powerful thoughts about us as people. And that can then send this into another level, as it were, of feelings and behavior. So just knowing that actually what we're telling ourselves, are we beating ourselves up with some of our thinking? Actually, that may be one of the things that we can tackle and challenge, so that actually that has less of an effect on our symptoms. So for some people, and part of what happens over time is that we're so aware that our stamina is not very good, our memory is not very good, that we become more and more attentive to our memory and our stamina, and we're looking out more and more and more for examples of when it doesn't work so well. And what then that does is mean that's using up mental energy, because we are attending to, we're hypervigilant, we're overthinking everything, and actually that's making things worse rather than better. So we call that hypervigilance, overthinking. So that might be one thing that starts to build up over time, because we know our memory is not so good, our stamina is not so good, our concentration is not so good. So we're looking out for it more and more and more. But that looking out for it is taking up mental energy and using up one of our balls that we're trying to juggling. Sometimes there are things going on where actually what happens over time, if we've got cognitive difficulties, that we interpret every lapse in memory, every lapse in concentration, every bit of cognitive fatigue as an example of what long COVID has done for us. And that might not always be completely accurate, because being human means that we forget things sometimes. We have memory lapses. Being human means our concentration is sometimes terrible and we're distracted by things. Being human means that those kinds of cognitive slips happen. And so it's important, in a way, not to over interpret everything that goes wrong with our cognitive processing as 100% due to long COVID. A lot will be, but equally we can it become what we call the good old days bias. We continually beat ourselves up, continually remind ourselves of who we were, because if we're continually interpreting everything rather than just going with the flow, then we're going to be constantly feeling worse about ourselves, because we are constantly saying, yes, but I wouldn't have done that because of before long COVID. So the more we can just accept that this is how it is, at least for now, the better, because it means that beating ourselves up, and also what it does, also it kind of removes the possibility of us seeing that actually, yes, I'm nowhere near what I was before my long COVID, but actually I have made improvements and I'm continuing to progress. I'm continuing to pull back little bits of normality into my life. I'm continuing to increase that green zone slightly. Well, if we continue just to say to ourselves, yeah, but I'm not the same as I was before, we can rob ourselves, as it were, of the good feeling of making progress and the things that we can do, rather than continue to remind ourselves of the things that we can't do. And that's what the good old days bias, as it were, can really make very, very strong, really strong sense of this is all that I've lost. Yes, and that's true, but also actually what it does is it extinguishes the more positive notion of actually, yes, but I am progressing, I am doing this, and this is what I can do, and I am still fulfilling these important values that are important to me in a different way. So that can be quite important. Well, the other thing is that it can happen with this process is that actually we apply more and more mental effort to things that actually don't need a lot of effort, the things that can just be done on autopilot. And so again, it goes back to that kind of hypervigilance. We pay more attention, we put more effort in, more conscious effort into everything that we do, and actually that might actually be using up an extra resource. And a really good example of how this happens in day-to-day life is professional golfers that get what's called the yips. And you may have come across this, you may not, but some professional golfers have had to give up professional golf because when they're putting, they've developed over time more and more conscious thinking about how best to make the putting movement. So more and more thinking about how I pull my arm back in a certain way, where the club needs to be, how I follow through on a ball, becomes more and more of a conscious thing because they're trying to improve it. But the yips happens when actually they're doing too much of that thinking. The overthinking actually impedes the physical motion that's just automatic. It's an automatic motion making a putting movement to putt a ball. And actually what happens is they can no longer make the putting motion. It actually, the overthinking actually just stops the automatic process completely, and they can't putt anymore. They can't play that part of golf and they have to give up. And that's a really, really good example in everyday life of what can happen if we overattend and put too much conscious effort into everything that we're doing, to things that actually we may be able to do in a more automated way. The other thing that can be really difficult is if we have very perfectionistic ideas about how we should operate as a person. So people who have got perfectionistic ideas will have very, very high standards. And even when we achieve these high standards, it's probably not good enough and we need to make them even higher. And if we have perfectionistic type thinking, that can be really difficult in terms of impacting on our COVID symptoms, because there'll be lots of things that we can't do as well. It's just impossible to do so well. And if our self-critical thinking is beating ourselves up every time we don't achieve perfection, which we know is impossible anyway, that can be another part of the thought processes that maybe don't help. And as we've already kind of just alluded to, that kind of that idea that I've just got to push on, it's mind over matter. I'm being weak, so I've just got to push on and be stronger. That again is a thought that maybe people will just push people into the boom bust situation rather than managing their thoughts and their symptoms most effectively. And then again, as I've just alluded to, if our thoughts stray into not just my memory's not very good, my short-term memory isn't as efficient, but go into therefore I am useless, therefore I'm a failure. If they go into those kinds of thinking, then that's bringing a whole new level of worry and stress and low feelings that again will kind of make the picture worse rather than better. And again, it's impossible to do all of these things in a perfect way, but just being aware that this could be something that starts to be part of the difficulties is really, really helpful. And what we'll find is if we are developing some of these things, there'll be unhelpful thinking styles. And these are just 10 very common ones. All or nothing thinking. If I'm not perfect, I've failed. Overgeneralizing. Everything is always rubbish. A mental filter, only noticing our failures but not noting our successes. Disqualifying the positive, noticing the negative stuff, and if I do positive, well, that doesn't count. That doesn't count. That's not really a positive. Jumping to conclusions, so mind reading, imagine we know what others think without testing it out, or predicting what's going to definitely happen in the future without necessarily looking at all the evidence. We may have catastrophization where where our thoughts just distort how bad something is going to be when actually the likelihood is that it's not going to be that bad, and actually the likelihood that of it happening is much lower than what our anxious or stressful thoughts are telling us. Another unhelpful thinking style that can happen when we're stressed or low is emotional reasoning, assuming that because I feel something very strongly, it must be true. I feel embarrassed, therefore I must be an idiot. Well, it may feel that way, but actually that thought is not accurate. And if we can catch it, we can challenge it. Very common unhelpful thinking style is having lots of shoulds and musts. I should do this, I must do this, I must do this, I should do this. Well, actually, then that may actually be something that's adding to our problems rather than helping our problems. Labeling ourselves, as we've just alluded to, telling ourselves I'm a loser, I'm a failure, well, that's clearly going to be a thinking style that's unhelpful and actually make our problems worse rather than better. And then the final one is kind of personalization, to kind of always attributing things as being our fault, something wrong with us, as opposed to considering the range of factors that could be operating. So again, it might just give us some clues and some hints to challenging some of the thoughts that may hinder maximally managing our long COVID cognitive difficulties. So overall, a summary of things to consider. And again, I just want to re-emphasize, nobody can do this perfectly. It's impossible to manage these difficulties in the ideal way, but just being recognition that there is a number of principles that might be helpful. So identifying factors that improve our symptoms or make them worse. Obvious one might be that when we sleep badly, we are more fatigued, we have poorer concentration, that puts us under more stress, and so our sleep is even worse. Take time to think about your resources and your demands. Our resources are the external support systems and our internal coping strategies, the people that we know, the things that we have at our disposal, the technology that we have, all of that, they're good resources. But to think about that in relation to our demands, making sure that we minimize the boom-bust pattern of low and high levels of activity. So finding that stable base of sustainable activity we can do day in, day out, come hell or high water, and slowly but systematically seeing if we can push that, particularly in terms of the things that we value and are important to us. So gradually increasing activity levels, just to see whether we can experiment with pushing that green zone a little bit higher. And that will help. That will help establish a shaken sense of ourselves that can be very, very significantly challenged and disrupted with long COVID cognitive difficulties. Our very sense of who we are is shaken often. And just gradually building some of these things into our lives, setting small goals that we eventually do achieve, can just help re-establish that sense of self-identity and that sense of reclaiming back normality. Maybe we need to be aware of how our relationship with our symptoms, how we respond to our symptoms, maybe with overthinking and hypervigilance, or the good old days bias, or something else. We may need to think about some of our thinking styles, particularly if we have perfectionistic thoughts, or needing to be in control in every single way. So people that are kind of into kind of what people sometimes call control freaks, don't they? Well, if you are one of those people that likes to have everything in control, or you're somebody with perfectionistic thoughts, actually maybe we need to challenge some of those thoughts, because they're probably not going to be ultimately helpful in maximally managing some of these cognitive difficulties. Again, going back to that resources and demands, consider how the increased effort and pushing oneself may actually be something that ultimately just is another demand, rather than something is a resource, as it were. Consider how consciously paying attention to the ways we're doing a task that we're undertaking may be not so good, overthinking, as I say, and trying to make maximum use of things that we get into structure, routine, autopilot, that don't use up any mental energy. And then consider how our thoughts and ideas about failing tasks, or the anticipation of failing things, may affect overall how we are managing. So that's a quick 50-minute overview of cognitive difficulties that are very common after long COVID, and some of the ways we might want to start to think about how we just understand what's going on, but also some of these practical things that we might want to consider that help best manage things. So I hope that's been a helpful little summary. I hope that the very best for you when trying to implement these things, and the very best to you in the struggles and the difficulties that occur when people have these cognitive difficulties after long COVID. And thank you so much for listening. Thank you.